Thank you. First of all, let me thank the Mediation and Education Center of Brno and the Center for Social Services of the Brno City Council and the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation for the work they've done to bring us all together here. This is just amazing, and for making the conference possible. I also especially want to thank Martina Sirbusova and Robin Berzobohati. I had to say not just Martina and Robin because I've been practicing those names for 3 weeks. Fellows of the ISCT for all their hard work. And finally, thanks for the invitation to speak here today. So in this presentation, I want to try to do two things. First, I want to say something about what it might mean to understand the world relationally. And I want to do this because this is one of the foundations of transformative theory, and I think it hasn't received enough attention. Second, I want to say something about what it might mean to engage in dialogue, not just as a facilitator or organizer, but as a participant. And I want to do this because I believe it will open up our understanding of dialogue and thereby our ability to engage and connect with others too, whether we're facilitators or participants. If we are right to understand the world relationally or dialogically, then it is, after all, the connections with others that are the very meaning of our lives. I often hear transformative practitioners say that transformative practice builds on a relational worldview. And in and of itself, this is vague. For a long time, it was the part of transformative theory I didn't really feel like I understood. In The Promise of Mediation, Bush and Folger talk about what they call, quote, a relational account of human nature and society, unquote, and they claim that dialogic moral philosophers describe this as, quote, the inherent moral nature of human beings. They say that this consists of, quote, a dual consciousness of simultaneous separateness and connection, unquote. This manifests in human beings as a capacity for agency and autonomy, as well as for connection and understanding, or, as we often say, strength and responsiveness. Dorothy Della Noce, who was a prolific transformative scholar and practitioner, describes what she calls a relational ideology. She says, quote, relational ideology portrays human beings as fundamentally social, that is, formed in and through their relations with other human beings, essentially connected to others, constantly relating to others through dialogue, and motivated by a desire for quality interactions with others. In spite of these strong statements, I think that many transformative practitioners have a hard time explaining what a relational worldview is. And more work has been done on the importance of agency and self-determination, most recently by authors like Baruch Bush, Peter Miller, Tara West, and Dan Simon, than on what a relational worldview entails. So in this presentation, I want to focus on the work of a few important dialogue philosophers. Focusing on dialogue philosophy can help us see things in new ways and help us see things we weren't aware of before. The thinkers I'm going to talk about today have given me a deeper and richer understanding of a relational worldview. It has changed how I understand and think about and practice dialogue. And I'm emphasizing an understanding rather than saying the understanding, because part of what this understanding entails is an embrace of the value of polyphony, or multiple voices that don't necessarily agree or merge. So today I want to sketch out one way to understand the world relationally, and then encourage you to respond and perhaps to think about your own understanding, which may or may not be identical to mine. So let's begin with Martin Buber, the author of the book I and Thou. Buber is considered one of the great philosophers of dialogue, and I imagine one of the dialogic moral philosophers that Bush and Folger had in mind when they wrote The Promise of Mediation. A Jewish thinker, Buber was born in Germany and fled to Palestine in 1938, where he became a professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Buber says that we can speak two basic words, I, you, or I, it. These read like word pairs, but Buber sees them as single words, I, you, and I, it. The I-it relation, in the I-it relation, I relate to the world as to an object. I see things in terms of their function. The it has instrumental value to me. When I say you, I'm not relating to an object, but to another subject. Buber says that whoever says you does not have something, but stands in relation. And he emphasizes the importance of relations when he writes, in the beginning is the relation. There is no isolated I. Whoever says I also says you or it. We're always relating. For Buber, it's the other people who make us human. It's the between, the relation that's present and real for us. Buber also says the basic word I-you can only be spoken with one's whole being. The basic word I-it can never be spoken with one's whole being. Emmanuel Levinas, another great but less widely known philosopher, is also important, I think, to understanding dialogue. Levinas, too, was Jewish and born in Kaunas in Lithuania. He moved first to Germany to study philosophy and later to France, and he wrote all his major works in French. During World War II, he was a member of the French resistance and survived the war, even though he was Jewish, because of his status as prisoner of war. His family in Kaunas, however, were murdered by the Nazis. Fortunately, his wife and daughter in France survived. His work can be seen as an attempt to counter philosophies that can lead to such horrors as the Holocaust. Levinas uses a different language to describe relations. For Levinas, the I is associated with what he calls the same. The other is other. He uses this strange terminology because he wants to describe how things appear or present themselves to us. What I think and my understanding is me, the same. You are other. Two things are worth highlighting here. First, the other is completely other. As another person, you're fundamentally different from me. I can't experience anything of your inner world. Second, the other transcends any attempt I might make to subsume the other into the same. In other words, I can try to make sense of you or to describe, conceptualize, categorize, or analyze you in ways that fit into my ideas of the world, but there's always something that evades such an attempt. Levinas would call this to thematize, because I'm invoking various themes or categories in doing so. He also says that violence is the attempt to make someone else the same as us or to bring them into a totality. In other words, a unified, closed point of view that erases their uniqueness and agency. The words totality and totalitarian share the same root. Both are systems created from one point of view with no room for other voices. A totality requires that I use ideas and categories that are mine, not yours. It requires objectification. But a human being is alive and conscious, not like my table or chair or the book I'm reading. The other person always exceeds any attempt at categorization because they are consciousness and because they respond. Levinas calls this transcendence. Levinas also says we are responsible for others in fundamental ways. The other appears to me as a face. He defines face as the way in which the other presents himself, exceeding the idea of the other in me. The face of the other is a living presence and one that speaks to me. Levinas says the face of the other calls me to responsibility. Faced with the other, I am infinitely responsible to them, and Levinas would say that we owe the other even the bread out of one's own mouth and the coat from one's shoulder. I cannot, according to Levinas, expect the same in return from the other. And this may seem like a strange paradox, but I think this is what makes Levinas's thought truly relational. We are not autonomous individuals who connect with others for our amusement or to satisfy our needs. We are responsible for others, and Levinas highlights the importance of what he calls the ethical relation. Levinas defines the ethical relation as a relation where I'm connected to an other without either of us being part of a totality and without either of us losing our individuality. This is very similar to what Bush and Folger called simultaneous separateness and connection. Levinas says that the ethical relation is accomplished through language. Language can connect us to others in ways that is ethical. He writes that through language, a relation is established that allows you to be connected to me, but still transcendent or unique and other. But Levinas also warns us that not every kind of discourse or speaking accomplishes this kind of relation. Forms of speaking breach the ethical relation when they seek to make the other part of a totality, that this is to make the other the same as me. He cites rhetoric as an example of this. Think of the following statements and the way they either try to solicit agreement from someone, simplify them, or make them fit into my system or categories of thinking. Trump supporters are just ignorant rednecks. Your problem is you overreact. Islam is incompatible with democracy. I think we basically agree on the most important points. Let's just try to get along. Based on this, we might be tempted to define dialogue as a form of speaking that avoids forms of speech like rhetoric. In fact, Levinas himself says that to renounce rhetoric is to face the other in a veritable conversation. In other words, true conversation is one that renounces rhetoric or attempts at defining the other or making them the same as us. The problem is that Levinas says rhetoric is part of every discourse. To put it another way, every conversation involves thematizing, conceptualizing, and categorizing, and this is unavoidable. Buber, too, says, "It is the sublime melancholy of our lot that every you must become an it in our world." So it would seem as if Levinas, and perhaps Buber too, has just led us down a dead end, promising us a form of dialogue that does not try to define or put others in a box, only to then tell us this is impossible. The solution to this dilemma lies in our presence and the presence of the other, in our conversation. Levinas says that the presence of the other is a coinciding of the expressed with him who expresses. Let me repeat that. The presence of the other is a coinciding of the expressed with him who expresses. In other words, you and what you are saying coincide as you are speaking. There are two things about presence that are essential here. First, the face of the other. It's their presence, after all, that exceeds my attempts to subsume them into a totality. Some of you may have seen the film, The Imitation Game, about the scientist Alan Turing, who cracked Germany's code during World War II and played an important role in the defeat of the Nazis. The name of the film refers to a test that Turing developed to tell the difference between communication from a computer, i.e. artificial intelligence, and a person. Both the person and the computer had to be in another room, and the person trying to tell the difference could only evaluate written responses to questions. I'm not going to get into a discussion about whether machines have intelligence or not, but notice nobody is talking about artificial transcendence. Only human beings are transcendent, not machines, and that's why the person and the machine need to be in a different room from the person receiving the messages. Otherwise, there would be a coinciding of the expressed with him who expresses, in the case of the human, and this would be the big difference between the human and the machine. The second important thing about presence is that even though our speech includes rhetoric, or speech that categorizes, conceptualizes, and thematizes, the presence of the other means that they're actively thematizing. The other thematizes rather than appearing as a theme. What I mean is that you propose ways of understanding or categorizing the world when we speak together, but you're doing it actively. You yourself aren't appearing to me as a category because you're present to me. For example, you might say, I think we need to frame the work the Institute is doing differently. We need to put more focus on the relational nature of transformative theory. Here you would be introducing a theme, but you're doing it while actively speaking and relating to me. No one is categorizing or thematizing you. It's an act, not a result, and I am also present to respond. Levinas says that thematization is an act where the other proposes a world to me, and he says that when the person I am speaking with is present, they can come to the assistance of their discourse. In other words, they can explain, modify, develop, or change what they are saying as they speak, and their presence demands a response from me. The point isn't that thematizing or conceptualizing is bad or unethical, and that avoiding thematizing is good. We can't avoid thematizing if we're speaking. The point is that the other and I are both present in our conversation. Levinas says that the ethical relation is defined by excluding any expression or utterance that is not known to those in the relation. Our relation is ethical, even if we're thematizing, as long as we are present and speaking to one another, as long as we get to actively participate in the dialogue. We are present to come to the assistance of our discourse, and we're present to respond. It's worth noting that the words response and responsibility come from the same root. If I'm responsible to the other, then the first thing I do is respond. Levinas notes that a responsible response is a personal response. You can't offer someone else's response. This requires attention and listening as well as engagement. It requires that I take you and what you are saying seriously. It does not require that I agree with you or that we become the same or that we enter into a totality. It does also not necessarily require politeness or calm. At this point, I want to bring in the ideas of a third great dialogic moral philosopher, Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin was a Russian scholar during the Soviet period and is most well known for his work on the Russian writer Dostoevsky. His most famous book about Dostoevsky, though, is as much about dialogue as it is about Dostoevsky, because he argues that Dostoevsky is a dialogical writer. There are a number of ways that Bakhtin is similar to Buber and Levinas. Like them, Bakhtin also says that dialogue is characterized by presence and the ability to respond. Bakhtin says that in dialogue, the points of view expressed are not those of a non-participating third person. Every utterance in the dialogue belongs to someone present. Bakhtin also says that the way of response is not just answering another, but having to answer for myself. Taking responsibility means to answer for myself, and that means to concretely respond to someone. Bakhtin is also important, though, to our understanding of dialogue because he says that dialogue isn't just an activity, but it's a feature of the world. We can understand the world dialogically or monologically. Bakhtin lists two important characteristics of a dialogical world. The first is polyphony, and the second is unfinalizability. Let me explain each of these in turn. Polyphony refers to multiple voices that do not merge into one vision or into a totality. Yes, he too uses the word totality. In a monologic view, the other and their discourse is an object for me. In a dialogical view, the other is a subject. Sound familiar? Another characteristic of a dialogical world is what Bakhtin calls unfinalizability. We can think of this as unclosedness or indeterminacy. Definitions, categorizations, and descriptions from the outside seek finality and unity. They seek to put us into a fixed definition. And yet, precisely because human beings are consciousnesses and have agency, they can also choose to surprise us. Bakhtin says that unfinalizability is the ability to render untrue any externalizing and finalizing definition. You could say that I'm lazy, and then I could choose to work hard. You could say that I'm mean, and I could choose to do or say something kind. Even in cases where a person has done harm to someone, the final word has not been said. That person has the possibility to recognize what they've done and to take responsibility for it. He writes that Dostoevsky saw the reification of a person's soul, or the attempt to finalize someone or see them as fixed and unchangeable, is degrading. This comes back to the fact that we're present in our dialogue and that we can respond. We are not finalized until we are dead, when we can no longer respond or answer for ourselves. Bakhtin says that all of Dostoevsky's work was a struggle against a reification of man, of human relations. It's important to stress that none of the above means that the truth is relative. It just means that we can only know the truth partially, and that all voices can contribute to our understanding of truth. At this point, it might be useful if I sum up some of what this means, though I realize offering to do a summary for a conference room full of transformative practitioners is a bit ironic. I feel like some of you should do a summary, but I'll give it a try. We can understand the world monologically or dialogically. A dialogical world is characterized by the presence of many voices that do not necessarily merge, and by unfinalizability, the ability of people to render untrue any definition I might give of them. We can relate in two ways to people, through I-you or I-it relations. When we relate to others, they remain other. It's language and speaking that connect us in an ethical relation as long as we're both present and can respond. When I respond, I'm taking responsibility and I'm answering for myself. The understanding of dialogue that these dialogic philosophers point to is a lot to take in, I realize. But they also shed light on another important topic: how dialogue relates to peace and justice. Dialogue is often employed as a tool for peace building. I think those who use dialogue this way do so because they hope that dialogue will lead first to understanding and then to peace. Dialogue is also criticized because it is essentially an individual level interaction that cannot address systemic change and therefore cannot contribute to justice. In other words, it seems like there's an acceptance for the use of dialogue in the service of peace, but less so for the use of dialogue in the service of justice. And this strikes me as strange, since so often peace efforts consist of trying to erase or forget differences, to bring people into a unity or totality which we call peace. I want to challenge the view that dialogue cannot contribute to justice and show that by building on what I've just said, dialogue can be understood as first being in the service of justice, and that it is for this reason that dialogue can also be in the service of peace. Levinas uses the word justice in two ways. First, he calls justice the face-to-face approach of the other. He does so right after he has talked about how renouncing rhetoric is to face the other in a veritable or genuine conversation. He says that speaking to another person is a disengagement from objectivity, presumably because objectivity is objectifying, and then he writes, "We call justice this face-to-face approach in conversation." In other words, justice is speaking with another who is present, and in another place he writes, "Justice is a right to speak." What Levinas is saying is that being able to speak with another, to use one's voice, to participate in what is being thematized, that is fundamentally just. Without this interpersonal level of justice, there cannot be justice in a systemic sense. If a world is created where you have not been allowed to participate, then that process is violent and unjust. It's simply an expression of power. Being able to respond is also being able to come to the aid of our discourse, to counter what is being said, to protest. For the one engaging with the other, discourse is also justice because we're facing the other and having to answer for ourselves. But there's a second sense in which Levinas uses the word justice. Levinas says that the world does not just consist of one other. If in the world there were only you and me, then I would be infinitely responsible for you. In this case, there would be no need to speak about justice responsibility would cover it. But there is not only you and me, there is also a third person, and a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. This raises the question, to whom do I owe what? Figuring out what is just requires analysis, thematization, theories, interpretation. But when we do this, we need to be clear that it is the responsibility for the other that is at the basis of our efforts. The ethical relation to the other comes first, and we are present to one another and able to respond to what is being proposed. If we accept what Levinas is saying here, then it seems clear that dialogue actually is justice, and dialogue is at least necessary to determine what is just, because it is only in conversation where everyone affected participates that justice can be done. Remember that this happens in the context of the complete otherness of the other. The other and I do not need to become the same, to agree, to become part of some intellectual system or totality for this to happen. True justice honors and maintains difference and the polyphony of multiple voices and perspectives of dialogue. The point isn't that we're going to fix all the world's problems by talking. The point is that we need to talk to figure out what is just, and we need to talk to know how to act as a result of that. And talking does more than convey content, it establishes relationships. Martin Luther King did not just appear in Montgomery, Alabama with a ready plan for boycotting the buses in town. The Montgomery bus boycott and many other direct actions of the civil rights movement were the result of many, many conversations that took place in Black churches, in homes, at barbershops, and many other spaces as people figured out how to respond and what to do. We honor Dr. King for his leadership, and rightly so, but there were many, many more who stood and marched with him and who talked with him and with each other. It's no coincidence that totalitarian regimes restrict the freedom of people to speak with one another first. From this perspective, it also seems clear that if dialogue is useful in building peace, then this is precisely because it is so indispensable to justice. Dialogue isn't primarily useful for building peace because it helps us understand one another's views, though that's a good thing, but because it's where and how we create those views and build relationships, and because dialogue is the very basis of justice, if not justice itself. Earlier, I quoted Dorothy Della Noce, who said that relational ideology meant, among other things, constantly relating to others in dialogue. Dialogue is not just formal meetings organized across identity lines, nor is it primarily polite or civil talk. It's day-to-day interaction and conversation. It's the very essence of our lives. Dialogue is happening when people are present with and responding to one another. They do this with what Bush and Folger called the dual consciousness of simultaneous separateness and connection. I think this understanding of the relational or dialogical nature of our world reinforces our commitment to supporting personal agency and self-determination, because it grounds it in an understanding of responsibility for others and injustice. This is what a relational worldview means to me, at least at the present moment, but of course, I'm not saying any of this because I want to create a new totality or a system to have you agree with. I'm saying this to open up dialogue, to stimulate and challenge you to reflect, think, and most importantly, to respond. What do you have to say about this? What is your response? Join me in dialogue. Děkuji.
Joe Folger and Baruch Bush wrote in The Promise of Mediation wasn't just the ideas about the nature of the individual. They also asked they also made some statements about what is the nature of the society in relational worldview. So what would you say? What is the nature of the society? What is the relation between the individual taking relationally and the society?
What do you think?
I don't know. I have some answers, but
yeah,
it's my speech.
Well, I mean, I guess my first answer to that would be that we are not just individual isolated beings who happen to be in the same space. There's something else that connects us, and the very idea that we have language is because there are other people, you know. So I think a lot of our, I'm a political scientist, and a lot of our understanding of the nature of our political societies has to do with Thomas Hobbes's work of seeing people as being isolated individuals who are worried about threat from other people, right? Whereas if you take Levinas as a starting point, you could see we are other people who are not isolated and who have responsibility for one another, and that's a very different starting point. And I think that leads to very different thinking about the way our political communities are constituted. So if we think about, you know, the idea of being connected responsibly to someone means we have to ask, you know, how can we do the best possible thing for each person in our community, for example, rather than just thinking, how can I get what I want and satisfy my needs? So I don't know, that's a preliminary answer to that question.